In this part of the video, we will examine the step-by-step process of how to create and adjust a new snare using the Snare Frames preset pack. As a first example, we will randomly go through some presets and try to find a snare that fits our preferences. Then we will manipulate and change its various parts so you can get a feeling of how the overall process works. As a second example, we will create a new snare from scratch by selecting the parts individually, and in the last part we will create a snare by layering the complete pre-made snares contained within the pack. In this Cubase project, we have 3 ready-made kick and bass loops along with a few basic hi-hat layers in order to emulate a realistic scenario of any given track. These loops are in different keys for a wider example variety. We will begin by opening a new instance of Kick 2 and adding the MIDI sequence to our project. The MIDI node doesn't make any difference to the tonality of our preset unless we activate the key node tracking function, so any node you choose is just the same. Since the default preset of Kick 2 is a kick, we will load one of the presets of the Snare Frames pack from the DLC folder. DLC stands for downloadable content, and it's the default location of all the Snare Frames presets and elements. To make sure you install the presets and content to the right folders, please check the installation instructions contained within the preset pack. The first thing we notice when we load our first preset is that on the display window we only have the view of the sub-control waveform. As explained in the first part of this video, this waveform corresponds to the additional thump that we might want to add in order to enrich the low frequencies of our snare and give it a more specific tonality. If we scroll through the pre-made thumb curves of the pack, we will notice that these are actually waveforms of a specific straight tonal frequency, and each of them corresponds to a specific note. The purpose of that is to boost a specific tonal region of our choice in any given preset, especially in snares that lack a clear defined tonality in the low frequency region. In simple words, you can use them to tune your snare's low frequency to a specific note while boosting their low-end material. Each tonality comes in 2 versions, one with a low and one with a higher transient intensity, designated by the word click in its preset title. Let's have a listen and check their differences. The second thing we will notice is that their length is relatively short. The purpose is to add additional low-end and tonal characteristics only to the attack area of any given snare and not to the whole snare length. If you wish to alter the initial waveform length or shape, then feel free to do so with the nodes through the amp section. To view the click parts of our snare, we first need to activate the 3 click view buttons. Each part corresponds to the respective color of the click section: yellow for the attack, green for the body, and red for the tail. Before we begin though, a couple of tips. The first tip before we start is to go through the settings and make sure that the Kick 2 processing is in stereo mode. Even though it is widely accepted that the snare sound should always be in mono, there are producers out there that prefer to have it in stereo. All 100 presets of the pack are designed in stereo, yet the stereo information exists only in the high frequencies of the tail samples. The attack and body layers remain in mono. The purpose is to maintain a stereo width feeling for those who wish to use their snares in stereo, but not alter the snare sound significantly for those who wish to use it in mono. It's good to know that all 100 presets of the pack are gain staged and -18 dBFS when in stereo mode. That ensures that no time is wasted leveling each sample separately when mixing with gain stage, and that presets provide an equal level of perceived loudness when scrolling through them. So adjust your mixing level of your channel from the start. We are now ready to scroll through a few snares. As we can very easily detect, the preset pack contains such a vast variety of snare colors and characteristics that it will be very hard not to find one that fits your track. For the purposes of this first example though, we will keep one that fits our preferences, but we'll try to alter it so as to see the whole process in depth. Okay, so let's try to work with preset 71, for example. Since the selection of the preset was done while listening to the whole loop, it is advised to check the preset also in solo mode. That can help us to clearly listen to all the parts of the snare separately and decide whether any changes or alterations are required. Keep in mind that all presets are EQ'd, so feel free to make any changes to the EQ balance according to your own preferences. All presets come with a standard low shelf at around 140 Hz so as to eliminate any unwanted low frequencies. That allows for the thump layer to define the exact tonality we choose to any given snare. You can now simply change the thump tonality and bring the snare to the exact tonal frequency that you like without losing any of the initial snare character. Let's see it in practice. For the purposes of this example, we can also open a FabFilter Pro Q in order to see the graphic representation of the tonal changes. For an exact tonality match, you can add the track's bass tonality equivalent straight to the snare thump layer. In this case, our bass is in D sharp, so I will add that tonality thump. Please keep in mind that it's not necessary for the snare to be in the same tonality with the bass to sound good. The thump feature is meant to facilitate those who wish to adjust their snare tonality accordingly. Now that we have the snare thump in place, let's experiment by changing some of the layers. Let's assume, for example, that we don't like the body of the snare. By simply scrolling through the body layers, we can look for another better match. Same process can also be applied in the tail. All parameters of the snare can be manipulated through the controls of the respective click section for an even better match, allowing endless matching abilities between the layers. Don't forget that we can also shape every layer using its amp section. It's not hard to notice that the tail samples vary in length. This can result in longer snares than the ones we want for our track. Instead of using the amp envelope to shorten the tail to our preferred length, we can simply predefine it through the MIDI information. We can arrange the total length in the MIDI, for example 1/16, and then by pressing the gate button, we can automatically bring any snare that happens to be longer to that exact length. Let's see it in action. In this example, we will examine how to build a snare from scratch. Instead of using a preset this time, we will begin by selecting the parts individually. After creating our MIDI sequence as in the previous example, we can now begin building the snare from the ground up. First, we will start from the attack section. Let's scroll through until we find something that we like. Please keep in mind that the EQ, distortion, compression, and thump section are off, so everything might sound a bit rough in the beginning. One thing we can do is to create a low shelf in the beginning of the process as to clear any unwanted low end. Please note that the sample length of all attacks is exactly the same, and that goes also for the lengths of the body samples. The only part where lengths could be different is in the tail section. Once we find something we like, we can then proceed to the body and tail section of the snare. Since the parts are not tuned to the same note, we can achieve more accurate results by adjusting the pitch and starting position of the samples. It is advised to also try the phase reverse function, since in many cases the reversal of the phase in any of the samples might result in a better sounding phase relation in between them. In cases where the size of the layers might be larger than what we want in the crossover points, we can adjust its shape using the amp section for a more even transition. once we have completed the selection of our samples, we can add some extra thump to the low end. Any EQ, distortion, or compressor adjustments can optimize the results even further. Please note that when we're building our snare from the bottom up, the amp section of the thump layer needs to be adjusted either manually or by selecting one of the preset curves provided in the pack. In the third and final example, we will see how we can create a snare using whole or parts of complete snares. By loading samples from the Wave folder, we can access all 100 presets in their final exported form, meaning that all that samples contained in this folder are the exported versions of the relative presets. Snare 1 is the export of preset 1, Snare 2 is the export of preset 2, and so on. That allows us to enrich a snare that we already like with additional layers, or even stack up ready-made snares to generate more. For example, we can load the ready-made sample of the Snare 71, which we used in example 1, and then add an extra tail to it, or add another attack on top of it to enrich that specific area. By carefully editing the layer parameters, we can come up with a huge variety of extra characteristics for our snares. The fact that we're using an already processed snare as our basic layer also allows us to EQ, distort, or compress the samples further. The same principle can be used to stack up to 3 complete snares. Through the amp section and low-pass, high-pass filter, we can isolate only the area that we like on each given sample, and then blend them all together into a new sample. One crucial factor that you should take into account before starting your snare creation is that the snare consists of the third most important sound of your track after your kick and bass. Unless the kick and bass are really well made and balanced, the snare will be difficult to adjust. In addition, not every snare will fit all kick and bass loops. A snare that might fit one loop could sound totally different on another loop. Let's take the 3 loops of the project as an example. As you can hear, the exact same sound sounds totally different in the 3 given loops. Concluding this video tutorial, I would like to thank you for your time and attention. For any questions regarding the video or the product, please feel free to contact me at SounDirective.